thank you very much for inviting me to come to Bangkok to talk to this meeting. And what I'm going to talk about is really a continuation of a lecture I gave to this group a few years ago now in terms of serological tests. And as you'll hear from me, there's a lot of confusion in the literature about the word serological. So if you're expecting me to talk about biomarkers, I'm not going to be talking about biomarkers. That is not serology. That is the detection of biomarkers. Galactomannan, mannan, and other major cellular components of pathogenic fungi. So just bear that in mind because there is a tremendous amount of confusion, as you'll see from my last slide, in the literature, in the most recent literature, about fungal serology. Okay, no conflicts of interest with respect to the content of my lecture. Now, some of you, I think, probably did take part in this survey, which was recently published about the diagnostic capabilities of laboratories in this region. And this is one of a series of ongoing papers about laboratory capacity around the world, which has been an initiative which has been very useful. So if we abstract from this particular survey that was recently published, what laboratories in this region are conducting serological tests, and by that I mean tests for fungal antibodies. So we can look here, the data is sort of divided like this, the overall number of laboratories in terms of the number. 235 labs in this region which responded to the request to complete the survey, and it's broken down into three categories. Countries with less than 3,000 GDP, less than 3,000 US dollars. Those countries, for example, China, where I work at the moment, between 3,000 and 20,000 US dollars, and countries where the GDP is greater than 20,000 US dollars. So you can see that the majority of laboratories are in this middle category. We have some laboratories, 89, which responded in the lower category, and a much lower number of laboratories in the highest category, 44. So the data is broken down into Aspergillus species, serological testing for antibodies to Aspergillus, to Candida, and to Histoplasma. Of course, we have heard already at this meeting of other tests, other diseases where serology, antibody detection, is of some value. And we can see here, looking across, I'm not going to go through every data point here, but a fair number of laboratories actually do their own Aspergillus serology, for example, which is quite interesting because in the UK, 65 million people, very, very few laboratories do Aspergillus serology. So here we have laboratories across the whole region, to a certain extent, depending on their financial support and capacity. For example, in the highest category, we have nearly 90% of laboratories doing some form of Aspergillus serology. And the same really applies, but to a much, much lesser extent, to Candida and to Histoplasma. The Candida data is very surprising, but we're hearing all the time, really, that, and we've just heard, that there's not a tremendous sort of amount of faith in all the new tests that are being described for Candida diagnostics. And I think this figure here also reflects that. What is the value of Candida serology? And we've heard a bit already at this meeting about the detection of Candida antimannan. And there are some initiatives now in the region of looking at antibody responses to an enzyme like enolase. Enolase was a biomarker described in the 1980s by Thomas Walsh as a very, very useful biomarker in terms of the Directogen 123 assay. It was only on the market for about a year, but that was based on the detection of enolase, a very essential enzyme in the biology of Candida, but now we have initiatives describing the antibody response to Candida enolase. So there's a lot happening, and let's see how many of these tests actually come to fruition. I think it's also very useful just to remind ourselves about the exposure pathways if we're going to talk about antibody responses and whether or not we can distinguish between colonization and true infection. So just to be aware, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, exactly what's going on in terms of the respiratory tract and other organs of the body. There are many exposure pathways. The respiratory one is, of course, what we're really talking about most of the time here, but let's not forget the gut is a very important reservoir of Candida, and also does impact on the production of antibodies against Candida in the GI tract. And we just heard, and it's our own experience as well in Manchester in the UK, that of course we can detect Candida in the majority of molecular assays, and our microbiome studies show that Candida is very, very common in the respiratory tract, both the upper and lower respiratory tract. And just to sort of emphasize all of this, the distinction between respiratory pathogens and airborne spores and fragments, not just conidia, but also fragments of Aspergillus hyphae, for example. They are very allergenic and have a great impact on on fungal sensitization and also exacerbation of diseases like asthma. So it's not just viable conidia. And also, as I've just said, the fungi found in the gut, Candida, Saccharomyces, and so on. So yes, the size of the spore is very important. Whether or not you're going to get an antibody response to a very large macroconidium like Alternaria, which is so big it's not really going to get much further than the nose or the upper airways, and right down, following this timeline all the way down, the small conidia of Aspergillus, around about 3 microns in diameter. This is where you might possibly get, depending on the host immune status, an antibody response to an organism like Aspergillus. Okay, so again, just to sort of make this point, and I do apologize for laboring this particular point, but it's so important if we're going to understand the difference between biomarker detection and serology. So this is the definition: diagnostic identification of antibodies against a pathogen in serum. And in 2013, there was a very nice review in Current Fungal Infection Reports, which basically said the future of fungal serology is still to be seen. Let's talk about that in the Q&A session after this particular session. We've heard about molecular technologies and how valuable they have become, and the need for standardization still, and this is 10 years on now from when this was written, and the current complexity of fungal serology testing relegates most antibody testing to only larger clinical and reference laboratories. Is this still true? Looking at that data that's come out of this, this regional survey, a lot of laboratories seem to be doing some form of fungal serology. Okay, so the whole concept of fungal serology goes back beyond the 1960s. In the French literature, there's some wonderful work looking at various fungal components and their use in the detection of antibodies. But here I've just shown to my mind, two key papers that have been published. The precipitin test. We're talking about Aspergillus precipitans, not really understanding at this time whether we're talking about various IgG classes or IgM, and I'll mention that a bit later on. But we're talking about precipitin tests, where this sort of catch-all term is still used to this very day. So this top photograph here is one of my own, taken 50 years ago when I started my work as a mycologist in Leeds in the UK. This is the classic octolony precipitin test, and some of you may be very familiar with this. This is a gel on a glass slide. The large central well contains serum from the patient, possibly a patient with an aspergilloma, and around this large well you have various antigenic extracts. And this is where the problems start. What antigens do you use in this sort of test? We talk about cytoplasmic antigens, very crude soups of cell wall antigens, also extracellular antigens, antigens which are found in the supernatant, in the culture medium in which you grow your fungus to make these various components. And of course, a lot of these are now commercially available and have been for a long time. So here we have a very strong precipitin antibody response to a variety of Aspergillus antigens, suggesting this patient had an aspergilloma. And this test can be used to monitor disease. If you're trying to treat an aspergilloma with a drug like itraconazole or voriconazole, quite a useful test. But it's very labor intensive. If you're doing 50 of these a day, this is a lot of work. And it takes 2 or 3 days to perform. And then you have the drying of the gel and the staining. So this, over the years, has been speeded up with a technique called counter-immunoelectrophoresis, and this is still currently used a lot in our laboratory and possibly elsewhere in the world, I don't know, but looking back at that survey data, there are laboratories in the region performing this sort of test. So this takes 90 minutes, and of course you still have the washing and the drying step, so it's still not a rapid test. So in the early 1980s, the whole technique of ELISA, initially for parasitic diseases, was actually announced to the community. And this was a massive a sort of revelation and improvement in how we can carry out tests for, not just for antibodies, but for biomarkers as well. We've heard a lot about that. So we, when I was working in Birmingham in the UK, we embraced ELISA and we started to look to see whether or not this technique could be used for Aspergillus antibodies. So this is something that we actually published in the early 1980s. Initially, ELISA tests would take a few hours. The incubation steps of a typical ELISA test, where you're charging the plate with an Aspergillus antigen or antigens, again, crude mixes of antigens, adding your serum sample with adequate washing, a few more hours. So we thought, well, this is crazy. This is taking such a long time. How can we speed this up? So this is quite a simple way of showing long ELISA, as it was called, plus the rapid ELISA, very short incubation steps, maybe 30 minutes for the crucial antibody binding to the antigen in the 96 well ELISA plate. So yes, really very little loss of sensitivity and specificity here. So this is where we are today with the commercial tests which are available. So bringing all this forward now, what tests do we use? What antibodies are we trying to detect in terms of Aspergillus disease? And the size of these circles here tries to denote, to give an idea of the numbers of patients. So patients with allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis, this is an allergic manifestation, allergic disease. We're talking about Aspergillus-specific IgE, and of course we can detect that using a variety of methods, which we'll just very briefly look at. Then we have chronic pulmonary aspergillosis, and they're the sorts of patients that we see in the National Aspergillosis Centre in Manchester. In the UK, 65 million population, we have about 3,000 patients with chronic pulmonary aspergillosis. So you can scale this up according to the size of the country. So here we're talking about a combination of IgE detection and specific IgG. And then, of course, we have invasive aspergillosis, and we'll just briefly touch upon this. Does antibody detection have any value whatsoever in the diagnosis of invasive aspergillosis? We've heard a lot about biomarkers like galactomannan. We've heard about Aspergillus PCR, but what about antibody detection? It's something we may dismiss, thinking, oh, these patients are so immunocompromised, they're not going to be producing antibodies. So there are a number now, very many of them, Aspergillus-specific IgG assays. So we've gone through the traditional methods, immunodiffusion, octolony immunodiffusion, immunoelectrophoresis, so-called precipitin test. We have many in-house immunoassays. They're not standardized. And then, of course, we have the standardized assays. So this is the sort of machine, the so-called ImmunoCAP, that we use a lot in our center to determine IgG levels, IgE levels, IgA levels, whatever antibody class you want to think of, for about 600 or more different allergens. So in terms of aspergillosis, for example, We have the problem of cutoffs. This has not really been determined. We have some idea of what the positive negative cutoff should be, and here I've shown maybe between 27 and 90 milligrams per litre, but in different populations. Then we have all these new alternatives, and we have Biorad. Biorad have made for a long time, and Aspergillus antibody assay, ELISA assay. And then we have a French company, Bordier, and German companies like Sirion. So the point is here, a variety of antigens are employed, and we still really don't know. We have no consensus about what particular component of Aspergillus should we be using in these assays. Conidia, extracts from Conidia, or should we be using extracts from biofilms, from fungal balls, which you can grow in the laboratory, and you can prepare your own antigens? We don't actually really know. So we've heard a lot already about lateral flow devices. They exist for Aspergillus antibody detection. This is a company called LD Bio. It's a French company, and we have done a lot of work and published a lot of work on this particular test. It detects both IgG and IgM. There's a renewed interest in the detection of IgM in the diagnosis of Aspergillus disease, and also for Candida as well. But here we're looking at the lateral flow device for detecting Aspergillus IgG and IgM in patients with chronic pulmonary aspergillosis, patients with COPD, patients with Aspergillus asthma, and so on, all these various groups of respiratory patients. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. And thanks. So a very affordable test, $2 or $3, very good long shelf life, so it's perfect for resource-limited countries. So we've been doing a lot of work in various African countries and trying to introduce this test with no vested interest. We just think this is a very valuable test in different settings. So I'm sure you're aware of this, but the so-called assured criteria, affordable, sensitive, specific, user-friendly, extremely rapid and robust, equipment-free. You can use a scanner to scan the intensity of the line on this, as you can with other lateral flow devices, for example, Aspergillus streptococcus, and deliverable to the end user. So this, from our point of view, we think these are the requirements for a lateral flow device, a point-of-care test. So just a brief mention about invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. Here we have a very recent paper, potential value of serum Aspergillus IgG antibody detection for the diagnosis of invasive and chronic pulmonary aspergillosis. So this is worth looking at if you're interested. So their data suggested that the detection, the presence of Aspergillus IgG did distinguish invasive pulmonary aspergillosis from community-acquired bacterial pneumonia and healthy controls. So, of course, their conclusion, serum Aspergillus IgG antibody detection may have a certain value in the diagnosis of IPA. This is not a new idea. There are many papers in the literature demonstrating that Aspergillus IgG detection may have some value in conjunction with all the other tests that we've been talking about at this meeting in the diagnosis of invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. So moving on then to diseases which we very rarely see in the UK or in Europe, but there are imported cases, of course. You're much more familiar with this, this disease than I am, but it's endemic, fatal in HIV-infected individuals. There are antibody tests available, both in-house and commercial tests based on immunodiffusion, indirect immunofluorescence, and, of course, ELISA. So these can be very rapid tests, ELISA especially. It is endemic in various parts of the region. I've just drawn out from this review that came out in Emerging Infectious Diseases, looking at the prevalence of various fungal diseases in China. And this shows you the areas where tularomycosis is found. And there's a long history of antibody detection in tularomycosis. Again, we don't have time to go through all of the data here, but it just shows you on the left-hand side the various methods, the ones I've described already for other diseases, immunodiffusion, immunoblotting, and so on and so on and so on, indirect ELISA. All of these tests have been applied to the detection of antibodies against Penicillium Saccharomyces monnefi. We've heard a lot about mucormycosis in terms of molecular methods. Yes, a lot of work is going on at the moment. In terms of serology, there are no commercially available serological tests, but a lot of work has been done on antibody detection. And we have also a lot of work, which I won't go into because that would detract from my theme of serology. We have a monoclonal antibody against fucomannan, and this is the development of a point-of-care test for Mucorales biomarker, not an antibody test. So let's wait and see. This is a little diagnostic company in the United States that's developing a potential point-of-care test, which I've discussed with some of you in the audience, for diagnosing rapid early diagnosis of mucormycosis based on antibody detection. So histoplasmosis in China, high prevalence areas are shown here on this map from the same survey published in Emerging Infectious Diseases 3 years ago. And it's quite useful from this paper to look at the evidence for acute infection caused by histoplasma. And we can see here we have various tests. We haven't talked about complement fixation. That's quite a complicated test for laboratories to carry out. We have immunodiffusion. We have these various bands in the precipitin test. Think right back to the Octoloni double diffusion test I showed you at the beginning of my talk. But different bands of different sizes and widths can be used to detect the presence of precipitins against histoplasma in acute disease. And we can see here, in terms of the various types of disease caused by histoplasma, whether it's acute pulmonary or it's disseminated, we can see here the varying levels of sensitivity based on antibody detection. And again, a lot of data here. This is taken from the laboratory in the United States called Miravista. They perform these tests for the whole of the United States, and we can see here the various tests that are used in terms of serology, IgG and IgM antibody, and also in terms of coccidioides. And some of these tests are now available as lateral flow devices. Briefly then, finally, pitheosis is again something beyond our experience, but I understand it's well known in this region. It's mainly pathogenic in mammals, horses and dogs, but as we've heard, transmissible from the environment to human beings, primarily found in this country, and there are a number of tests which are available for determining the antibody levels to this disease. Immunodiffusion again, ELISA and Western blotting, but of course also PCR has a role to play here. So lots of new developments, separate lecture in terms of Schizophyllum, Rhizopus, Pneumocystis, Crypto, Sporotrichosis, and Scedosporiosis. There are antibody tests being described now for all of these diseases, so let's see how they perform in real life. I'm not talking about biomarkers. I just want to make that very clear. We've heard a lot about these biomarkers in other lectures. Okay, so this is the further reading. I always suggest further reading, and this is where the confusion still comes in. The paper in the center of this slide here by Connie Lasfleur and colleagues from Austria, Serology Anno 2021, fungal infections from invasive to chronic. The word serology here is used incorrectly. This paper is about biomarkers. It's not about what I've been talking about. And even my good friend and colleague from Cardiff in Wales in the UK, Lewis White, I think just a couple of weeks ago, published this paper, Developments in Fungal Serology. This paper is about biomarkers. There's a hint of what's happening in terms of antibody detection and what molecules are being used as antigens to detect antibodies. But again, just be aware of this confusion. So here we have then a very brief overview of what has been going on over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and trying to bring this up to date in terms of how useful or not so useful antibody tests are for diagnosing the infections that we see in this part of the world. Thank you very much.